When my father didn't show up at my son's funeral, everyone assumed it was grief. The truth was uglier. While we stood under gray skies lowering a tiny white casket into the ground, he was sitting in a private bank office 300 miles away, wiring $75,000 to a woman half his age. I found out not from him, but from the transaction alert that hit my phone as the priest said the final prayer. I remember the sound, a soft vibration, a cold reminder that even in death my father could make everything about money. At first I told myself there had to be an explanation. There always was with him. Business, timing, investments. Words he used to paint over betrayal like fresh coats of white paint on a crumbling wall. But this time it wasn't a deal. It was personal. And by the time I traced the account and saw her name, I realized he hadn't just abandoned the funeral. He'd used my son's death as cover to move funds he'd been hiding for years. That's when I stopped grieving and started documenting. I didn't confront him that day. I just drove home silent, my suit soaked from the rain and my hands still shaking from holding the last handful of earth. My wife sat beside me, staring out the window. We didn't speak. There's nothing to say when the person who raised you shows up in absence more loudly than they ever did in life. The next morning I logged into his joint accounts, the ones we used for the family construction business. I wasn't supposed to have access anymore, but the passwords hadn't changed since 2014. There it was, an outgoing transfer, $75,000 exactly, labeled consulting fees. The recipient was Marianne T. Holdings, a name that sounded corporate until I checked the tax ID. It wasn't a company. It was her, his mistress, 43 years old, no registered business, living in a condo that used to belong to my mother. I sat there staring at the screen, remembering the day he promised that property would go to my son when he turned 18. My son never reached 8. I opened my notebook and began writing everything down. Dates, sums, statements, routing numbers, even the names of the bank officers. Not for revenge yet, just because it was the first time in months I felt control over something. My father always said control was a myth. He used it as an excuse to hurt people, to cheat, to manipulate. It's not personal, son, it's just leverage, he'd say after every business fallout. But this time it was personal. This was my child, my grief, my silence. 2 days later, a courier showed up at my door with a manila envelope addressed to me in my father's handwriting. Inside was a check, $10,000, and a note that said, "Take care of the arrangements. I'll reimburse more once things settle. Don't make this harder than it has to be." That was it. No condolences, no words about his grandson. Just a transaction like I was his employee again. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, the smell of flowers already turning sour. The check lying between coffee stains and sympathy cards. That's when something in me went cold. I folded the note, put it in a separate folder labeled evidence, and called the bank pretending to be his assistant. Within 10 minutes, I had the wire confirmation faxed to me. The signature matched. He hadn't even tried to hide it. Same pen, same flourish under his name. It wasn't grief that kept him away. It was greed. By the end of that week, I'd gone through every shared folder from the business drive. Invoices, receipts, subcontractor logs. He had funneled nearly $240,000 in consulting to the same woman over the last 3 years. Always through different shells. Northview Partners, Sunridge LLC, MTH Services. All traceable. All sloppily disguised. The only reason it went unnoticed was because I'd stopped looking years ago, after walking away from the company when my son was born. I thought leaving was freedom. Turns out it was cover for him. I didn't tell anyone, not even my wife. I just kept collecting. Every file I copied went into an encrypted drive labeled TS Archive. I knew I'd need it, because my father never lost control of anything voluntarily. Then came the message. A single line from him sent at 10:47 p.m. on a Friday. "I know you've been digging. Don't make me cut you out completely." I read it twice. Cut me out of what? The inheritance? The business? Or the last illusion that we were still family? I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the message to myself, attached the transfer records, and backed everything up to a second drive. I started sleeping with that drive in the nightstand drawer, next to my son's baseball cap. Every time I opened it, I'd see the cap and remember why this wasn't just about money. It was about erasing what he tried to buy silence with. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from his attorney. It was official notice that he was restructuring assets and that any prior promises regarding property distribution were revoked pending reevaluation. I drove to the attorney's office the next morning. The same man who'd handled our family estate for 20 years couldn't meet my eyes. "It's out of my hands," he said. "Your father's chosen to move his holdings privately." Privately. That word echoed. I knew exactly what that meant. Hidden accounts, offshore entities, transfers under Marianne's name. I thanked him politely, walked out and sat in my truck for almost an hour before starting the engine. Then I called an old friend, Daniel, a CPA who used to handle corporate audits for us before my father fired him for asking too many questions. I told him everything. He didn't sound surprised. "He's been doing it for decades," Daniel said quietly. "The only difference now is you finally have proof." We met 2 days later in a small diner off the highway, the kind that still used paper menus and ceramic mugs. I handed him the drive. He didn't ask why I wanted it traced, he just nodded. "You're not planning to confront him yet, are you?" I shook my head. "Not yet. I'm planning to make it official." Daniel looked at me for a long moment and said, "Then you'll need a forensic accountant and a lawyer who doesn't owe him favors." That was the first real step. I wasn't acting out of anger anymore. It was something cleaner, precise, like watching gears turn back into alignment after years of rust. By the time Daniel sent me the first report, I had a full map of my father's empire. 12 shell companies, 4 active trust accounts, and 1 recurring beneficiary, Marianne. Everything pointed to a single account in the Cayman Islands. 2.8 million, money siphoned slowly over 6 years disguised as investment capital. It wasn't just betrayal, it was a system. And now for the first time it had timestamps, paper trails, and witnesses. I knew exactly how to dismantle it. Daniel warned me that if I moved too fast, he'd smell it. My father had a network of people who owed him favors. Lawyers, bank officers, even a retired judge he played golf with. So I played it his way. Quiet, polite, invisible. I kept attending Sunday dinners at his house, pretending nothing had changed. Marianne was there sometimes, always just stopping by, carrying those expensive handbags that didn't fit our small-town backdrop. She'd pour wine, laugh too loud, and call him darling like she owned the place. He loved it. Loved how people stared, how my mother's old friends whispered. He thought shock was power. I thought silence was sharper. The night that changed everything started small. He asked me to help finalize a sale on one of our old properties, an industrial lot near the river. "It's just paperwork," he said. "You know the city better than my new guys." I agreed, though I knew what it meant. One more fake sale, one more transfer into his hidden fund. I signed nothing. Instead, I recorded everything, every call, every meeting, every signature. When I checked the escrow documents, I noticed a name under secondary beneficiary. Marianne T. again. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. I went home, opened my laptop, and drafted an email to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Not an accusation, just a concerned report. I attached 6 files, wire logs, invoices, the sale document, and a screenshot of the Cayman account ending in 3492. I didn't sign my name, but I left enough breadcrumbs that if they checked, they'd trace it to him. Then I waited. Weeks passed. No calls, no letters. My father carried on like nothing happened, hosting barbecues, posting smiling photos, making speeches at the Rotary Club about legacy. I almost believed it had all gone nowhere. Until one afternoon his accountant called me in a panic. "Your dad's accounts have been flagged," he whispered. "Federal audit. They're freezing everything." I said nothing, just listened to him breathe heavy into the phone. "He's asking questions," the man added. "He thinks someone tipped them." I hung up, drove to the marina, and watched the sun go down over the water. It was the first time I felt calm since the funeral. That night, my father showed up at my house unannounced. No warning, just headlights sweeping across the driveway. He came in without knocking, the same way he always had. "What did you do?" he asked. His voice wasn't angry, it was scared. I'd never seen him scared. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. He slammed his hand on the table. "You think you can ruin me? Over a woman?" I looked at him and said, "No, over a wire transfer." The room went quiet. His face turned pale. He knew I had it, proof, files, leverage. The silence between us stretched like a rope about to snap. Then he whispered, "You're making a mistake. You'll go down with me." I just said, "Then let's see who falls first." He left without another word. Within days, subpoenas arrived. The company was under federal review. Every shell, every trust, every transfer, all under scrutiny. Marianne disappeared. Her condo was sold, her number disconnected. My father tried to shift blame, saying she'd manipulated him. But the documents told another story. His name was on every transfer, every signature, every lie. The empire he'd built on control was collapsing in real time. And I didn't have to touch a thing. By the time the investigation went public, reporters were circling. I never spoke to them. I just mailed an envelope to the lead investigator. A printed copy of his note from the funeral week. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." I added a single line beneath it. "I won't." When the indictment came through, 5 counts of fraud, 1 of tax evasion, I didn't feel triumph. Just an empty kind of balance. He called once from his lawyer's office asking if we could make this go away. I told him I already had, by letting the truth handle it. Then I hung up. 2 months later, I stood at the same cemetery where my son was buried. The grass had grown back. The stone was clean. I left no flowers, just a single folded document, his signature from the transfer that started it all. As I walked back to the car, I thought about what Daniel had said. Control isn't power. Accountability is. When my father was sentenced, the court seized his assets. The house, the business, the accounts, all gone. I didn't attend the hearing. I was in the park with my wife, watching kids chase kites in the wind. She asked if I felt lighter. I said, "Not lighter. Just done." Months later, I received a letter from the IRS, an official notice that the recovered funds had covered all outstanding taxes and debts, leaving a balance of $47,000. "You're entitled to reimbursement as an impacted beneficiary," it said. I didn't cash it. I framed it. A reminder that sometimes revenge isn't fire, it's documentation. When people ask what happened to him after that, I tell them the truth. He lost the only thing he ever valued: leverage. I didn't need to destroy him. I just let him meet the mirror he'd spent his life avoiding. He once told me, "Money makes people loyal." But standing there, looking at my son's grave and my father's ruined empire, I realized he was wrong. Money just reveals who never was. After the trial, people stopped saying my father's name out loud. Small-town memory works like that. Silence is its own obituary, but silence doesn't erase the paperwork. For months, envelopes kept arriving at my house. Notices, settlement letters, court copies stamped in red. Every one of them started with the estate of Thomas J. Hale. That was his name. It still feels strange to write it in past tense. The estate was worth $3.2 million on paper, but when the liquidators were done, it dropped to less than $400,000. I didn't fight for any of it. I only claimed what had been my son's. The small savings account he'd opened for him years ago, the one labeled Future College Fund. The balance was $12,816.07. I didn't touch the money. It sits untouched to this day, accumulating quiet interest because some things are worth more preserved than spent. After the sentencing, I got a call from a journalist named Keller. He'd been covering white-collar fraud for the state paper. "You were the whistleblower, weren't you?" he asked. His voice wasn't accusing, just curious. I didn't answer. He said, "We're doing a story on legacy, on sons cleaning up what fathers broke." I hung up. Legacy. That word had been poisoned for me since childhood. My father loved that word. He used it to excuse everything. The long hours, the missed birthdays, the partners he bankrupted. "It's all for the legacy," he'd say. But legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you take from others to build your name. 2 months after the verdict, Marianne resurfaced. Not in person and in paperwork. Her lawyer filed a claim against the estate, arguing that some of the funds were joint investments and she was an innocent business associate. I almost laughed reading it. The irony of calling theft an investment. I could have ignored it, but I didn't. Instead, I met with the estate administrator and handed him a folder. Inside were transcripts of her emails, recorded calls, and transfer logs Daniel had recovered from a corrupted drive. The lawyer flipped through them in silence. When he looked up, I said, "That's your innocence." Her claim was denied in full 3 weeks later. In late spring, I drove back to the old construction yard, weeds growing through the gravel, the office windows dusty, the sign half fallen. That place had built everything my father owned and destroyed most of what mattered. Inside, I found his old desk still locked. I pried it open. Inside was a single notebook. Not ledgers this time, not receipts, just pages of numbers, notes, and a line that stopped me cold. If he ever turns on me, he'll become me. Maybe that was his last illusion, that corruption was hereditary, that all sons grow into their father's shadows. I tore that page out, folded it, and burned it behind the shop. After that, things got quieter. No reporters, no lawyers, just time. My wife started smiling again. I began rebuilding slowly. Not the business, but something smaller. A carpentry workshop, just me and my hands, no partners, no investors, no signatures to fake. I didn't want empire anymore. I wanted honesty in measurement, inches, wood, weight, not lies. Some nights I'd stay late, sanding until my palms ached, and think about how easy it is to mistake control for peace. It's strange. When people hear what happened, they expect fury or guilt. I don't feel either. I just feel distance, like I've stepped out of a long storm into air that finally smells clean. My father once told me you can't fix what's already broken, but maybe you can choose not to build the same way again. After everything settled, people treated me differently. Not better, not worse. Just with that polite caution reserved for someone who's been through fire and didn't come out burned the right way. At the hardware store, men I'd known since childhood would nod and say, "Hell of a thing your dad went through," as if he were the victim. I'd smile and say nothing. Because explaining truth to people who worship appearances is just wasted breath. My father built a lifetime out of those appearances. Donations to the church, scholarships, plaques with his name on them. You'd think he was a saint if you only looked at the surface. That's how money works. It polishes a man until you can't see what's rotting underneath. The irony is, I learned that lesson from him. I just applied it differently. About 6 months after the sentencing, I got a letter from the State Department of Commerce. They were auctioning off remnants of his companies, vehicles, tools, equipment, everything not seized as evidence. I drove there out of curiosity. The yard was packed, contractors, collectors, random locals hoping to grab something cheap from the hail liquidation. I stood there, watching men raise numbered paddles, bidding on things that used to define my family. The excavator that built the high school foundation sold for $12,000. His favorite pickup went for $3,800. A rusted steel cabinet labeled Archives was about to be junked when I stepped forward and bought it for $50. I didn't know why, just impulse. When I opened it later that night in my garage, I found stacks of rolled blueprints, invoices, and an old manila envelope marked TH Private. Inside was a single sheet of paper, notarized 15 years ago, a loan guarantee for $150,000 signed by my mother. She'd covered his debts back then quietly with her savings. He'd never repaid it. He'd let her die believing the company was secure, when in truth she'd been the collateral. That broke something in me that the trial never did. Because it meant his betrayal didn't start with me. It started with her. She was the first casualty of his greed, not me, not the business, not even the mistress, just her. The kindest person I've ever known, erased by the same man everyone admired. I sat there until dawn, tracing her signature with my thumb. It was shaky, faded, but familiar. That morning I made a decision, not out of rage, but duty. I contacted the same journalist who'd called me months earlier, Keller. I said I'd talk on record, not to expose anything new. The case was public, but to tell the truth that never made it into the papers, who he really was before the money, before the fraud, before the downfall. Keller came with a recorder and a small camera. We sat in my workshop among the smell of sawdust and varnish. I told him everything, how my father treated loyalty like currency, how he bought silence, how he traded guilt for gifts. I showed him my mother's guarantee, the envelope, the timeline. Keller didn't interrupt. He just let the tape run. When he finally spoke, he said, "This isn't about crime. It's about inheritance." I said, "Exactly. Not the kind you can spend." The article came out a month later under the headline, "The Cost of Legacy." It wasn't sensational. It didn't need to be. It was clean, factual, devastating in its restraint. It detailed how every donation, every handshake, every award had been built on invisible debt. People read it. Some called it brave, others called it betrayal. The truth is, it was neither. It was just necessary. The day after the article dropped, I got an email from Marianne. No greeting, no apology. Just one line. He always said you'd finish what he started. I didn't reply, because in a way I had, but not the way she meant. He started corruption. I ended it. He built walls. I documented cracks. He hid money. I exposed it. The legacy he worshipped died with him, but the truth stayed alive. A few weeks later, I went to my son's grave again. It was quiet except for the wind. I brought a new baseball glove I'd been meaning to show him. Left it there, along with the framed IRS letter, the proof that all debts were cleared. I whispered, "We're clean now." It wasn't closure, but it was peace, the kind that comes when you stop owing anyone anything. That night, as I closed the workshop, I saw something glinting in the corner, one of the brass nameplates salvaged from his office. It said Thomas J. Hale and Son. I turned it over and engraved a single line on the back with my chisel, "Legacy paid in full." Then I placed it on the shelf, face down. Some names don't deserve to face forward anymore. At 40 years old, I'd thought I understood loss. But grief doesn't end, it just changes shape. Some days it's heavy and silent. Other days it moves through you like smoke. I spent that summer working quietly, rebuilding the workshop from the ground up. I didn't advertise. Word spread naturally. Old clients started coming by, not for business, just to talk. Maybe they were curious how the son of Thomas Hale turned out. Maybe they saw something familiar in the way I measured twice and cut once, the way I refused shortcuts. A few even apologized, said they wished they'd known what was really happening back then. I told them not to. People believe what benefits them. That's human nature. One man said, "You could have rebuilt your dad's company if you wanted." I looked at him and said, "That company died the day it lied to itself." Around that time, I began receiving letters from the correctional facility where my father was serving his sentence. The first one was polite, formal even. "I hope you and your family are doing well. I'm working on my appeal. There are things you don't understand." I didn't respond. The second was shorter. "You're my son. You don't destroy blood." I didn't respond to that one either. But the third one, handwritten, shaky ink, stopped me for a moment. It said, "I did what I knew. You'll do the same one day." I tore it in half, but I didn't throw it away. I kept the pieces in a drawer beside my son's glove, maybe as proof that even broken things can hold memory. Then, late one night in November, I got a call from the prison chaplain. My father had collapsed during recreation hour, heart failure. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. No dramatic ending, no apology, no reckoning, just another line in a report. The chaplain asked if I'd like to claim the body. I said yes, not out of love, out of responsibility. Some debts need closing even if they were never yours. I arranged a small burial, no speeches, no guests, just a plain pine casket and a nameplate that read Thomas J. Hale, 1949 to 2023. The same minister who'd spoken at my son's service read a few words. When it was done, I placed the two halves of that torn letter into the ground with him. After the burial, Marianne appeared again. She stood at the edge of the cemetery, wearing black sunglasses, holding a bouquet she never laid down. She waited until everyone left, then walked up to me. "He loved you, you know," she said quietly. I almost laughed. "He loved ownership," I replied. "There's a difference." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You got what you wanted," she said. "He's gone. The money's gone. What's left?" I looked past her at the two graves in the same earth and said, "Peace. That's what he couldn't buy." She didn't respond. She just turned and walked away, her heels sinking into the mud. The next week, the estate attorney called. The remaining assets, what little there were, had cleared probate. The official report listed 1 pickup truck, 1 safe deposit box, miscellaneous personal effects. I went to the bank to see the box. Inside were a watch, an old family photo, and a sealed envelope marked with my name. I opened it in the parking lot. Inside was a single check, $47,000, the same reimbursement amount the IRS had issued to me months earlier. On the memo line, he'd written, "For what I owe." The signature matched, steady and deliberate. I don't know when he wrote it, before prison or after, but it didn't matter. I walked back inside, signed the back, and donated every cent to the local youth center under my son's name. Because that money had already taken too much life from this family. Life didn't become easy after that, it just became quiet. I started teaching carpentry classes to teenagers, mostly kids who'd never had fathers around. Some of them reminded me of myself at 15, hungry to build something real, to measure their worth in effort, not inheritance. I told them, everything you build teaches you who you are. Don't rush it. One of them asked once, "Did your dad teach you that?" I said no, he taught me why it matters. Winter came early that year. I remember standing outside the workshop one evening, snow falling on the roof, and realizing the world finally felt still. No lawyers, no accounts, no ghosts demanding attention, just the sound of wind against the door. For the first time, I let myself breathe without waiting for consequence. My father's headstone sits 3 rows from my son's now. 2 names, 2 legacies, one built on lies, the other on love. Every few months I visit both. I bring tools to fix what the weather has worn down. Not to mourn, just to maintain. Because that's what I've learned. The hardest part of repair isn't the damage. It's deciding what's still worth keeping. In the months after the burial, I began noticing how empty the world sounded without someone to argue with. Not silence, emptiness. The kind that hums behind the noise of everyday life. My wife said I was changing, that I seemed lighter but distant. She wasn't wrong. When you spend years preparing for confrontation, peace can feel like withdrawal. I didn't know what to do with calm. I started waking up before dawn, walking the back roads behind our house. I'd watch the lights spill over the fields, think about how everything keeps moving, indifferent to what we lose. It used to make me angry. Now it just made me quiet. The workshop grew busier. Orders came in faster than I expected. Tables, frames, shelves, nothing fancy, just honest work. I hired one young guy to help, 22, fresh out of community college. His name was Eli. He didn't know the story. I never told him. But one afternoon, as we were loading lumber, he said, "My dad took off when I was 3. Guess it's just me and Mom." I nodded, said, "Then make something he can't claim." He smiled like he understood. Maybe he did. Maybe that's the closest thing to legacy I'll ever believe in again. About a year later, Keller reached out again. He said a documentary team was doing a follow-up piece on families affected by white-collar crime, and they wanted to include mine. I declined. "I'm done being a story," I said. He paused and replied, "You already were one. Now you get to decide how it ends." The line stayed with me longer than I expected. That night I went through my father's old folders, what was left of them. Receipts, tax forms, fragments of empire. I started scanning them into digital files, labeling each carefully. Archive, closure. It wasn't for revenge or publication. It was so no one could rewrite what happened after I'm gone. Documentation as inheritance. One evening I visited the youth center where I'd donated his final check. They'd used the money to build a small woodworking lab. Nothing large, just a few benches, drills, and hand tools. On the wall above the door they'd hung a small plaque, the Samuel Hale Workshop. My son's name. I stood there for a long time just watching the kids measure sand, argue about whose line was straighter. They had no idea who paid for the tools, and that was the point. They were building from clean wood. Fresh grain, no stains. Not long after that I received another letter, this time from Marianne. The handwriting was different, smaller, careful. She said she was working at a florist shop now, trying to rebuild her life. She apologized, not for the affair, not for the money, but for the part she played in a world built on lies. She ended it with, "He once told me you'd inherit everything." I think he meant more than money. I didn't write back, but I didn't throw it away either. I folded it, placed it next to my son's photo in the desk drawer, and left it there. Maybe forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It just means stopping the audit. Spring returned like it always does. Sudden, green, unapologetic. I repainted the workshop, replaced the roof, and started mentoring 2 new apprentices from the youth center. The kind of kids who showed up early and stayed late because they didn't have anywhere else to go. One of them asked why I never put my last name on the sign outside. I told him, "Names come with baggage. Craft doesn't." He laughed, said that was the most old man thing he'd ever heard. I didn't argue. He was right. I was turning into someone older than my years, but not bitter, just finished with pretending. One morning, while sorting through old mail, I found a letter I'd written to my father years before the fallout, never sent. It was dated March 2016. I'd written, "You're building something I don't understand. Maybe one day I will. Reading it now, I realized I finally did understand. He was building a monument to control. I was building an escape from it. We were never in the same business. Later that year, I decided to visit the state archives where all the case files were stored. I signed the visitor log, requested the boxes with his case number. The clerk wheeled them out, a dozen brown cartons filled with statements, receipts, transcripts. Every lie had a paper trail. I flipped through them slowly, page by page, until I reached the final document. Case closed. Assets liquidated. I asked if I could keep a copy. She said yes. I walked out holding it under my arm like proof that history could finally stop repeating itself. That night I sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey, watching the horizon burn down into dusk. My wife came out, leaned on the railing, and said, "You've been quiet again." I said, "I'm just thinking about the day he told me money makes people loyal." She smiled softly. "And what do you think now?" I looked at her, then at the fading sky. "I think loyalty isn't bought. It's built, one honest piece at a time." She put her hand over mine. No words after that. Just the sound of crickets, wind through the grass, and the steady pulse of something that finally felt like peace. By the second year after my father's death, I'd started to forget what his voice sounded like. Not completely, just the tone, how it carried over a room, how every sentence came with a built-in expectation of obedience. Losing that sound was strange at first, then freeing. Some nights I'd wake up and realize it had been weeks since I'd thought about him at all. That kind of peace feels like guilt when you're raised to believe loyalty means carrying the weight forever. The workshop had become my anchor. Orders kept growing. We built custom furniture for local schools, a new altar for the church, display cases for the town museum. People trusted my measurements again, and that meant more than they'd ever know. One afternoon, the mayor stopped by to ask if I'd consider joining the Chamber of Commerce. I almost laughed. My father had once chaired that same board, the same seat from which he'd greased every deal in town. I told the mayor politely, I work better without committees. He didn't press. Later, I realized that was progress, saying no to power and feeling nothing. Around that time, Eli, the young guy I'd hired, found an old photograph in the storage cabinet. It showed my father and me at a job site years ago. I must have been 18, holding a measuring tape while he pointed at blueprints. Eli said, "You look proud there." I studied the photo for a long moment. I said, back when I thought he was building something for both of us. I took the picture home, cut out my half, and pinned it above my desk. Not to forget him, but to remind myself that legacy isn't shared, it's chosen. Then came the notice I didn't expect, a certified letter from a trust company in Chicago. Inside was an account statement for something called Hale Educational Fund. Established 15 years earlier, beneficiary unknown, funded with irregular deposits, exactly the kind of hidden channel he used for everything else. The balance was small, $112,000, but the timing didn't make sense. The last deposit had been made 6 months after his arrest, meaning someone else had kept it alive. The statement listed a contact, Marianne T. I stared at it for a long time before calling the number. She answered after the third ring. Her voice sounded older, quieter. "I wondered when you'd find that," she said. "Why keep it open?" I asked. "Because he wanted it to exist," she replied. "He said it was the only thing that wasn't for him." I didn't believe her, not entirely, but part of me wanted to. "What happens to it now?" I asked. "It's yours," she said. "I already signed it over." I told her to close it instead, transfer everything to the youth center. She hesitated, then said softly, "He'd hate that." I said, "Then it's perfect." That night, I thought about how every piece of his empire had somehow ended up funding strangers, kids, apprentices, small projects. Maybe that was justice. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just redistribution. The world has a way of balancing, slowly, precisely, without permission. By the third winter, the house felt warmer. My wife had started painting again. She'd stopped years ago when the grief was too heavy. She filled the walls with quiet colors, muted blues, rust, pine green. She said, "I'm tired of gray." I told her, "Me too." On weekends, we'd drive out to the lake, sit in the truck, drink coffee, and watch the frozen water crack under the wind. We didn't talk much about the past. It wasn't denial, it was preservation. Some things heal better unspoken. Occasionally someone would bring up my father in conversation, usually at a store or diner. They'd say, "He was a hard man, but he meant well." I stopped correcting them. Truth doesn't need to argue with memory. One night at a charity auction, I saw a plaque honoring the late Thomas J. Hale for contributions to community development. The organizers had found an old donation record and resurrected his name. I didn't protest. Let them keep their illusion. I'd already reclaimed the only legacy that mattered, my own. The following spring, a documentary crew visited town. Not Keller's team, a new one. They were interviewing families for a series called In the Shadow of Wealth. They asked if I'd speak on camera. I told them no, but they could film the workshop. They spent a day recording tools scraping wood, sawdust falling like snow, the rhythm of honest work. The segment aired months later without narration, just ambient sound. Viewers online said it was oddly peaceful. No one even knew who I was. That anonymity felt better than any headline. A few weeks after the broadcast, Eli came in early, holding a folded newspaper. "They're calling you the man who rebuilt quietly," he said, grinning. "Guess you're famous." I shook my head. "Fame's just noise. Let's get back to work." He laughed, and we did. That summer, I replaced the sign outside the workshop. It no longer said Hale Woodworks. It just said Samuel's Place, not mine. Not my father's, my son's. Every piece we built after that carried a small engraving underneath. Made with what's left. Sometimes I think about what he'd say if he saw all this. The stripped-down shop. The modest life. The simplicity he'd call failure. He'd probably smirk and tell me I could have gone bigger, richer, louder. Maybe he'd even call it wasted potential. But I know better now. The loudest revenge isn't ruin. It's peace so complete that the noise of the past can't reach you anymore. By the time 3 full years had passed, the town had rewritten its memory of my father. It always happens that way. People forget the scandal, keep the parts that make for good dinner stories. He became complicated, misunderstood, and a man ahead of his time. I stopped fighting it. Let them have their version. I had mine documented line by line, sealed in 2 hard drives, one at home, one in a bank vault. Every transfer, every forgery, every lie. Sometimes I'd think about deleting it all, letting it dissolve into nothing. But that archive wasn't vengeance anymore. It was insurance. Not against anyone else, against forgetting what denial looks like. Forgetting makes repetition easier. The workshop was steady now. I had 4 employees, most from the youth center. We built things that lasted. Church pews, benches for parks, memorial crosses for veterans. Simple, honest work. The kids called me Mr. H, even though I told them to just use my first name. They said it felt respectful. I let them. One morning, a delivery truck dropped off a new batch of cedar planks. And as I ran my hands along the grain, I thought about how wood records everything. Pressure. Storms, drought, age, and still holds together. Maybe people could too. It was around that time I started writing. Not for anyone to read. Just to make sense of how something as quiet as money could destroy an entire bloodline. I filled 4 notebooks over that winter. No drama, no flourishes. Just facts, moments. The little things that get lost in courtroom summaries. The day he missed my son's funeral. The sound of the transfer alert. The smell of wet soil. The silence after the verdict. I called it Ledgers of Silence. I didn't mean for it to be poetic, it just fit. When I finished, I stored the notebooks in the same cabinet as the old photo Eli had found. That cabinet had become a museum of mistakes, preserved for whoever comes next. One evening, Eli asked me something I hadn't expected. "If your father walked in right now, what would you say?" I thought for a while. "Nothing," I said. "I'd hand him a tape measure." He laughed, confused. "Why?" "Because it's the only honest way to measure value," I said. "And it doesn't lie." He nodded slowly, maybe realizing it wasn't really a joke. A few months later, the state sent me an invitation, an award ceremony for community restoration efforts. Someone had nominated me, probably from the youth center. I didn't want to go, but my wife convinced me. "It's not about him anymore," she said. "It's about what came after." The event was small, held in the renovated courthouse my father had once helped fund. I stood there listening to speeches about resilience and rebuilding, trying not to think about the irony. When they called my name, I walked up, accepted the plaque, and looked out over the crowd. Half the faces were strangers. The other half were people who'd once toasted to my father's empire, I said only one thing into the microphone. Some things fall apart so better things can be built with the same hands. Then I walked off stage. The next morning, the article hit the local paper. Son of disgraced developer honored for rebuilding community. The headline didn't bother me. If anything, it felt accurate. You don't get to choose your lineage, only your repairs. That summer, I started restoring the old Hale construction yard, not to reopen it, but to turn it into something else. We stripped the broken sign, replaced it with Hale Community Workshop. Anyone could come in. Retirees, kids, single mothers, veterans to learn basic carpentry for free. The first day, a woman came with her teenage son. She said he'd been expelled for fighting. She wanted him to have somewhere to go. I handed him a hammer and said, "Here, we don't hit people. We hit nails." He smiled for the first time that day. That was the moment I realized revenge had finally turned into restoration. At night, when the shop was empty, I'd sit alone and think about my father, not as a villain or victim, just as a man shaped by the same world that nearly shaped me. He believed power made permanence. I'd learned the opposite. Permanence comes from letting go. Sometimes I wondered if he'd see what I'd built and call it weakness. I hoped he would, because what he called weakness was the only thing left standing. By fall, the leaves turned gold around the workshop. The smell of sawdust mixed with cold air reminded me of when I was a kid, working beside him before everything went wrong. But the memory didn't hurt anymore, it just felt like history, not a wound. My wife would stop by with coffee, and the kids from the youth center would tease me about being the old guy with morals. Maybe they were right. Maybe all I'd really done was age into peace. But peace earned after truth is the hardest kind to lose. Sometimes people ask why I never changed my last name. The truth is I didn't need to. I'd already changed what it meant. That's the real revenge. Not ruin, not exposure, not even justice, just redefining a name so completely that the old one stops echoing. By the fourth year, everything around me had stabilized, but inside, something still hummed an unfinished vibration, like a machine that hadn't powered down fully. That's the problem with revenge. It ends on paper long before it ends inside you. My life looked peaceful, steady orders in the shop, dinners with my wife, Sunday drives, but beneath it all was a quiet vigilance. I kept expecting some echo from the past to return, some unfinished ledger to demand attention. It came one gray afternoon in late October. A certified envelope arrived, bearing the seal of a national bank I'd never dealt with. Inside was a formal notice. Notification of unclaimed asset recovery client, T.J. Hale. It listed an account I didn't recognize, opened almost 2 decades ago under a trust named Horizon Initiative. Balance $286,400. I stared at it for a long while. The paper smelled like dust and old air conditioning. There was no contact listed, only a return address in Delaware, the same state where my father used to hide most of his shell companies. The letter said if no heir claimed it within 60 days, it would be absorbed into state funds. I didn't tell my wife. I just drove. 6 hours to Wilmington, a small brick building tucked between a law office and a diner. Inside, the manager confirmed the account was legitimate. Mr. Hale set it up in 2004, he said. No withdrawals since 2018. It lists you as contingent beneficiary. I asked what the account was for. The man pulled a file, flipped through the pages and said, "It appears to be an educational endowment. Beneficiaries are listed by initials SH, my son's initials. The last deposit had been made 2 weeks before the funeral. I don't know why that broke me more than anything else. He hadn't shown up that day, hadn't stood beside me in the rain, but he'd wired money ahead of time as if trying to buy redemption in advance. I didn't touch the funds. I told the manager to transfer every dollar to the youth center. He asked if I wanted a receipt. I said no, just close the account. On the drive home, I thought about how people like him always tried to solve guilt with math offset pain with payments, betrayal with numbers. He'd spent his life moving money to avoid consequence, but this was the first time his transaction felt almost human, and that was what hurt most. The late realization that somewhere inside him there might have been a trace of regret, too weak to speak, but strong enough to linger in an account no one knew existed. When I got home, my wife was in the kitchen painting again. The smell of linseed oil filled the house. She looked at me and said, "You found something, didn't you?" I nodded. "Nothing important," I said. But she could tell. Later that night, I told her everything, the account, the amount, the initials. She didn't say much, just took my hand and said, Maybe that's his apology. I didn't answer. Apologies require presence, and he was long gone. But the thought stayed with me. Over the next few months, I started cleaning out the old house, his house, the one that had sat empty since the estate sale. Dust coated the windows. Spiderwebs hung like gray lace across the ceiling. The rooms felt smaller now, as if his absence had shrunk them. In the office, the walls were lined with plaques and photographs, groundbreaking ceremonies, ribbon cuttings, charity galas. Every one of them was dated, every smile rehearsed. I took them all down. Behind one, I found a hidden safe built into the wall. Inside were stacks of envelopes, each labeled with a year. 1997, 1998, 1999. I opened the first. Inside were handwritten note reminders, debts owed, private agreements, signed in his meticulous script. But at the bottom of the stack was something different. A photograph of me and my son fishing by the river, both of us laughing. On the back, in faded ink, he'd written, "He saved us even if we didn't deserve it." I don't remember how long I stood there. I just know the room blurred, and for the first time in years I didn't feel anger, just fatigue. Maybe he'd been trying to tell me something all along, but men like him never used words, only ledgers. I left everything else in the safe, locked it, and closed the door behind me for good. As winter settled in, I noticed how the town had changed. New developments were rising, cleaner, stricter zoning, no shortcuts, no inflated bids. People still mentioned my last name in meetings, but now it came with respect, not suspicion. The youth center doubled in size, and the kids who'd once learned to plane wood were now teaching others. I watched it happen from a distance, proud but quiet. That was the kind of empire worth building, one that couldn't collapse under greed. In early December, Keller sent me a copy of his new book. The inscription read, "For those who understand that revenge is just another word for closure." I read it over several nights, each chapter a reminder of how many families had been undone by ambition, by men like my father. I wasn't unique, just another son cleaning up after an empire built on arrogance. But reading those stories made me realize something simple. I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired but clean. That winter, a storm rolled in, the kind that knocks power out for days. I sat by candlelight, the wind howling through the workshop walls, and thought about how, in another life, my father would have been out there fixing damage, shouting orders, making sure everyone saw him working. I didn't move. I just listened. When the wind eased, I whispered, "We're done now," not to him, not to anyone in particular, but to the cycle itself. The next morning, sunlight cut through the frost on the windows, turning everything gold. The smell of cedar filled the air. It felt like the world exhaled. And for the first time in years, I believed it was truly over, not because I'd destroyed him, but because I'd stopped building from his blueprint. By the time the 5th year came, I thought everything that could surface from the past already had. But ghosts have their own schedules. One morning, as I was stacking timber behind the workshop, a black sedan pulled up. A man in a suit stepped out, mid-50s, polished shoes, the kind of calm that comes from long careers in finance. He introduced himself as Robert Lane, estate auditor for a regional bank merging with one of my father's former lenders. "There's a discrepancy you should know about," he said. I almost laughed. There were always discrepancies. He opened a folder and showed me a set of documents, loan guarantees, forged signatures, personal bonds my father had co-signed under my name more than a decade earlier. I felt that old chill again, the one I thought I'd buried with him. Lane explained that most of the debts were expired, statute of limitations long past, but a few had been refiled when the companies were bought. Technically, they can't collect, he said, but they could try to sue. "You'll need counsel." For a moment, I just stared at the papers, seeing my name where his should have been. Even after death, he'd managed to leave fingerprints on my identity. I thanked Lane, took the file, and said, "I'll handle it." That night, I sat in my office reading line by line. Each document was dated between 2010 and 2012, during the years when I'd been running construction sites and trusting him to handle the contracts. Every one of them bore my forged initials. It wasn't surprising, it was familiar. But there was something different this time. I didn't feel rage, just focus. The next morning, I called Daniel, the same accountant who'd helped me unravel everything years ago. He listened, sighed, and said, he planned for control even after he was gone. That's what men like him do. We spent 3 days cross-checking each document, building a timeline. Daniel smiled faintly when we finished. "You realize you can turn this into something useful, right?" I frowned. "How?" "Teach it," he said. Show other small business owners how to protect themselves from people like him. It sounded ridiculous at first, but 2 months later, I found myself speaking to a room of local contractors explaining how signatures can be weaponized, how trust without verification is a loaded gun. The irony wasn't lost on me using his mistakes as curriculum. The talk ended with a line I hadn't planned. Documentation isn't distrust. It's self-respect. They applauded, and for once I didn't feel like an imposter. That same spring, a journalist from a national paper contacted me. He was writing about second-generation recovery children rebuilding after parental fraud. He wanted quotes, anecdotes. I told him I wasn't interested in being someone's redemption story. He said, then tell it your way. I agreed on one condition. No photos, no headlines about tragedy. Just the truth. The article ran under the title The Quiet Builder. It went viral for a week, shared across business forums and ethics classes. I ignored most of it until an email arrived from a man in Texas. My father ruined hundreds of lives. I've spent years trying to prove I'm not him. Reading your story helped. That line alone made the noise worth it. By summer, the youth center had tripled in attendance. We added new programs, metalwork, drafting, restoration. I taught them how to read blueprints, not because they'd all become builders, but because plans teach patience. One evening, a boy named Marcus, 12, quiet, serious, asked if he could carve something on one of the benches. I said yes. The next day, I saw what he'd etched with a chisel. Build clean. Simple words, perfect symmetry. I left it there permanently, lacquered over so time couldn't erase it. Still, even peace has echoes. Every year around my son's birthday, I'd feel that gravitational pull toward the cemetery. I never missed the date. This time I brought one of the benches from the shop and installed it between his grave and my father's. I sat there a long time watching the clouds shift, feeling wind move through the grass. I spoke softly, not to either of them in particular. It's strange, I said. You both taught me the same thing, how to stop chasing control. The words surprised me. For the first time, I felt gratitude without approval. That fall, Keller visited again, this time without cameras or questions. He handed me a flash drive. I'm retiring, he said. Thought you might want this. It's every recording, every transcript from your case interviews. You can erase it or keep it. Your choice. I held it for a moment, heavy for its size. Maybe I'll archive it, I said. Not to relive, just to remember, he smiled. That's all history really is, organized memory. Then he left, and I realized he was right. Some legacies are monuments. Mine was an archive. At the end of that year, my wife and I took our first real vacation. No agenda, no calls, just a cabin near the mountains. On the second night, snow started falling. She sat by the fire reading while I carved a small wooden box. When she asked what it was for, I said, receipts. For every year we didn't quit. She laughed, said that was the most accountant thing I'd ever said. Maybe she was right. But I kept that box. It sits on our mantel now, filled with ticket stubs, photos, and one folded letter. The last one from the prison chaplain, thanking me for arranging my father's burial. I never responded. Some closures don't need replies. When we drove home through the snow-covered roads, I looked at her, at the passing fields, and thought how survival eventually becomes its own kind of quiet wealth. Not the kind you deposit, but the kind you breathe, the kind you live. The 6th year passed without fanfare. No anniversaries, no breaking points, just life, finally allowed to unfold without debt to the past. Most mornings I'd open the workshop before sunrise, make coffee, and let the first light spill across the wood grain. The place had a rhythm now, the hum of saws, the shuffle of boots, the smell of pine and varnish. The boys from the youth center had become men. 2 of them started their own small shop across town, using tools they'd built themselves. Sometimes I'd stop by, pretend to critique their measurements just to watch them roll their eyes. That was the closest I'd ever come to fatherhood again, and it was enough. One day, Eli came into the office with a folder. I think you should see this, he said. Inside was a legal document, a notice from the city council naming Samuel's Place an official community heritage site. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The same council that once blacklisted my last name now wanted to preserve it. The certificate carried my signature line, blank and waiting. I signed it with steady hands, realizing the circle had closed, not with vengeance or ruin, but with something simpler, endurance. Later that week, I took a drive to the old riverbank where the photo of me and my son had been taken. The waterline had shifted over the years, the trees thicker, the air quieter. I sat there until sunset, watching the ripples catch the fading light, thinking about how many years I'd spent chasing explanations, waiting for apologies that never came. But forgiveness isn't something you receive. It's something you decide to stop withholding from yourself. I whispered his name, then my father's, and let the silence between them mean whatever it needed to mean. When I returned home, my wife was painting again, this time a landscape, our workshop under a wide blue sky. She'd painted me in the corner, working on a bench, small but visible. "You should hang this inside," she said. I smiled. "No," I told her. "It belongs out front. Let people see what peace looks like." The next morning we hung it above the door, right where sunlight hit it at noon. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing in anyone's shadow. That night I opened the wooden box I'd carved during our mountain trip. Inside were the mementos of this quiet reclamation. The youth center flyer, a photo of the kids with their first table, my mother's old guarantee letter, a splinter from the original Hale construction sign, and that last note from my father, the one that said, "For what I owe." I added one more thing, a copy of the workshop's new registration papers stamped with today's date. Then I closed the lid for good. Sometimes people still ask if I regret going after him, if I wish I'd just let things go. I tell them this: letting go isn't the same as pretending it never happened. It's choosing to remember without carrying the weight. My father taught me how to build walls. My son taught me how to let the light through them. And somewhere between those lessons, I finally learned how to stand on my own foundation. When I lock the shop at night, I always look back once before turning off the lights. The benches gleam faintly under the lamp, the tools lined up like witnesses to a long, slow redemption. In another life, he might have been proud of this. But pride doesn't matter now. What matters is that it's clean, built from what's left. Built honestly, built to last, and maybe that's all any of us can do. Measure, cut, rebuild, and hope the next generation doesn't inherit our cracks. So tell me, where are you watching this from tonight?